Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 best cards from the Blackrock Mountain adventure. Now you might be wondering why I'm just now getting to the 10 best cards in Blackrock Mountain Adventure, and that's because standard format is almost here, and a lot of people are going to be looking towards old expansions to see cards that they might want to add to their decks to build the ultimate standard format deck. And Blackrock Mountain, while certainly not the strongest of expansions and probably in fact the weakest of all Hearthstone expansions when it comes to good cards, still does have 10 really good ones that can fit into a variety of different decks and make your decks more powerful. So if you want to run through the adventure and grab these cards, certainly wouldn't be a mistake, even now, well over a year since this expansion has arrived. So let's go ahead and start out with number 10. The 10th best card from this expansion is actually, in my mind, Blackwing Corruptor. This is a 5-mana 5/4, which is a reasonable stat allocation for the cost, but it's really the battle cry that makes this one so good. If you're holding a dragon, deal 3 damage. That damage can be either to a minion or to the opponent's face. So Blackwing Corruptor is a great mid-range minion for dragon decks. Most dragon decks are skewed towards the late game with lots of big, scary dragons that are going to win the game in the late game, so they can have a little bit of trouble keeping up in the early game and stabilizing the board. And that's what Blackwing Corruptor allows you to do. It allows you to play this on turn 5, kill something that the opponent's had around for a turn or two that might be weak or has low health, get it out of the way, help stabilize the board, trade effectively with Blackwing Corruptor, and set yourself up for big dragon plays in the future. So even though this is not a dragon itself, it's definitely one of the strongest dragon synergy cards that came about from Blackrock Mountain, and actually the only one that really makes this list. So a staple in dragon decks, and since there are some new dragons coming out in Whispers of the Old Gods, I think this card might actually see a resurgence in play and define even more dragon-style decks. Moving on to the 9th best Blackrock card, it is the Warlock card Demon Wrath. This is not the most played card in the world, I'll admit, but it really has found a home in Reno-style Warlock decks just because it's another great reliable removal spell that is preferential to your own side of the board, and that's nice because a lot of times you'll have a lot of imps out on the board or small demons in the early game. So this allows you to counter aggro decks while still preserving your own side of the board. And it's a well-costed spell. It does 2 damage to all non-demon minions, so that's cheaper than, say, a Paladin Consecration, for instance. But still has the same effects. You can get rid of all those nasty knife jugglers and all the silver hand recruits and all the scary stuff on the other side of the board. Also has some of the nicest artwork in the game, so that's a small bonus point as far as I'm concerned. But a nice, solid removal spell that in demon-style Warlock decks and really just late-game style Warlock decks is a great option on turn 3 and still has some power in the late game as well. Moving on to the 8th best card, it belongs to Shaman, and it's actually Lava Shock. This 2-mana spell is really the first card that was ever printed that addresses overloaded mana crystals, which is, of course, a staple for shamans. A lot of cards have overload, and it becomes very difficult to deal with, particularly if you overload, 2 or 3 or even 4 crystals in a single turn. But Lava Shock actually takes care of that, and it still has a powerful effect attached to it, which is a 2 damage spell. So you can do 2 damage to the enemy face, you can kill a knife juggler, or any other minion with 2 health on the board, and simultaneously unlock your mana crystal, setting you up for bigger turns. So you can make a really big turn the turn prior, pop off a Lava Shock, and still have some mana in reserve to follow up your previous big turn as well. This is most commonly seen in aggro shaman decks, which did dominate the ladder for a short while. It allowed them to pump out tons of damage all at once, play that Doomhammer really with no downsides because they just Lava Shocked all those overloaded crystals away and pumped in more damage. But as more overload cards are released and Shaman tries to find more decks, I think this could still fit into a lot of stuff. It's really not that costly in regards to the effect, just because dealing 2 damage is still pretty good most of the time, and having a spare 2 mana is really not that hard, particularly when it unlocks some crystals. So sometimes this is basically a free card because you unlock 2 mana crystals You get 2 damage basically for free because those crystals were gone anyway, right? So a lot of upside on Lava Shock, and a pretty well-designed card that I think has been underutilized, and we'll certainly see more play in the future. Moving on to the 7th best card, it is another spell at 2 mana, but this time it belongs to Hunter, and it is Quick Shot. This one is just so good. It does 3 damage, which is pretty normal for 2 mana spells like Frostbolt or Dark Bomb, but it has a great effect too. If your hand is empty, draw a card. That doesn't always go off because sometimes you just want Quick Shot for the 3 damage to remove a minion or hit the enemy's face. But when it does go off, it makes Quick Shot so ridiculously good because paying 2 mana for a card draw is really not all that bad in the first place, and you get the 3 damage as well. It's just tons of value packed into this bad boy. And the way that Hunter decks are typically designed to unload minions and be super aggressive and try to kill your opponent very quickly, sometimes you will top deck that Quick Shot and basically turn it into a second card. I've even seen people chain Quick Shot into Kill Command and that kind of crazy play to kill me off. So a lot of upside here, but also just some consistency. Even if it's just a deal 3 damage spell, it's still very good for Hunter's kit and filled a need for the class. Moving on to the 6th best card. This one might surprise some people, but I actually think it's Dragon Egg. As opposed to all the other, dragon style synergy cards, this one's not really a dragon synergy card despite having dragon in the name. But it is just a nice little value minion that fits into a couple different decks. Whenever this 0/2 minion takes damage, summon a 2/1 whelp. So this is kind of like a Nerubian Egg, but in a different way. It's a little cheaper. You really can kind of only get 4/2 in total value out of this thing at its base level without some buffs. But Dragon Egg is most commonly played in decks that do run a lot of buffs, turning it sometimes into a 1/3 or even more than that. So occasionally it will spawn multiple, 3, even 4 whelps, giving it kind of an endless value opportunity. It's been common in Paladin decks, Egg Paladin decks, Egg Druid decks as well. So it's fit into a couple different dominant meta decks in its lifespan. So even though it doesn't look like much of a card, it actually has some niche utility and has seen quite a bit of play. And as a neutral card that fits into multiple classes, I do think that gives it an advantage over some of the previous cards on this list that you might have seen more often or be more familiar with. Moving on to the 5th best card, it is the warrior card Revenge. This 2 mana spell is basically a whirlwind on steroids. It does 1 damage to all minions as its base effect, so it's just an expensive whirlwind that costs an extra mana. But of course, if you have 12 or less health, you can deal 3 damage to all minions instead. So this is really just a control late game style warrior kind of card that gives you stronger, more consistent AoE removal, whereas Whirlwind sometimes is good and deals with lots of Silverhand recruits or imps, and also of course affects your side of the board with Acolyte of Pains and all the other stuff that you like doing damage to your own minions. Revenge is that sometimes, in that it's only a slightly more expensive Whirlwind effect, so it can still be beneficial to your side of the board. But in late game situations where you've fallen really far behind on the board, maybe you don't have the Brawl yet or the spare mana for Brawl, Revenge still allows you to kill all those little minions that the opponent has stocked up over the first 5 turns, and play something else like an Armor Up or Shield Block or establish a minion on the board. So it gives you basically more flexibility, particularly when you're behind. And because Warrior is so likely to take lots of damage in the early game and get that health low and still able to recover and build up extra health thanks to armor, Revenge will go off against aggro decks and just kind of gives you a late game pressure release valve that says, yeah, you've done all this work to build your board, but sorry, I have a really cheap way to deal with it, and makes it actually, when it does 3 damage, one of the most efficient and most powerful AoE removal spells in the entire game, and that's why it's seen in a lot of different control style warrior decks. Moving on to the 4th best Blackrock Mountain card, it is the 3 mana Flame Waker. This is, of course, the defining card in Tempo Mage decks, and Tempo Mage decks have basically been around since Blackrock Mountain showed up and haven't gone away at all since. And that's because this card is just so ridiculously powerful. As a 3-mana 2/4, it's actually got really solid stats. You don't feel too bad about playing a 2/4 on 3. In fact, it trades really effectively into a lot of stuff. But it's the card effect here that's so good for Flamewaker. After you cast a spell, deal 2 damage randomly split among all enemies. Yes, that means when you play an Arcane Missiles, instead of just doing 3 damage randomly, it now does 5 thanks to Flamewaker. When you play the coin, you're also getting 2 free damage. When you play Frostbolt, suddenly it's a 5 damage spell. Flamewaker just takes all of the spells in your hand and makes them crazy good. So we've all seen those Flamewaker turns where they drop their Flamewaker and they play 4 or 5 spells all at once, and suddenly you have this giant board that looks like it's been flame striked. You've also taken a couple shots to the face, and suddenly all the work you've done is gone and you're close to dead and don't have an answer. So Flamewaker can provide those crazy swing turns just thanks to all the crazy spell synergy that it has. Sometimes it's just good on turn 3 as a body as well, but the raw value and tempo it can pack into a single card, and the way it makes all your other cards better truly do make it an archetype defining card, and arguably one of the strongest from Blackrock Mountain, but not the most seen as far as I'm concerned. So that's why, even though it's very good, it still only takes the 4th spot on my list. So let's move on to the 3rd best card. I actually give Imp Gang Boss the edge over Flamewaker here, just because I do think Imp Gang Boss shows up in virtually every kind of Warlock deck. That's both really aggressive Zoo-style decks, but also late-game control-style Warlocks like Reno or Handlock. So unlike Flamewaker, which really only shows up in Tempo Mage or aggressive Mage decks, this one just has more flexibility as far as deck archetypes. So it gets an edge there. Also, I just think it's a very, very strong card. 3-mana 2/4, much like Flamewaker. But anytime it takes damage, you summon a 1/1 Imp. So that means, yes, it can actually take 4 damage sometimes, which gives you basically a free 4/4, which is a total of 6/8 in stats for 3 mana, which is just totally ridiculous. But even if you only get 1 Imp out of Imp Gang Boss, that's a 3/5 for 3, which is very good, particularly because it's split across multiple bodies, which typically requires multiple cards to deal with. So you're thinning out your opponent's resources, you're forcing them to make tough decisions about how to deal with Imp Gang Boss, you're becoming slightly more resistant to AoE removal. It's great with buffs, it's great for early game board presence, it's great with knife jugglers. It can do so many different things so very well. It's arguably really just the best 3-mana minion in the game, just because of the raw value that it contains. So Imp Gang Boss to me is the best class card from Blackrock Mountain and the 3rd best card in the entire set. But there are 2 more cards I think are better, starting off with the 5-mana Grim Patron. We all know this one if you played Hearthstone shortly after Blackrock Mountain's release, because of course Grim Patron defined and created the Patron Warrior deck that synergized so well with Warsong Commander, and they were able to spawn lots of Grim Patrons and charge them all instantly in a single turn, killing you very, very quickly. Of course, that led to the nerf of Warsong Commander. It no longer gives 3 attack minions charge, so Grim Patron got kind of subtly nerfed as a side effect of that, but it still gets played in Patron Warrior decks because the minion itself is just so good in the Warrior set, because they have so many ways to spawn multiple patrons out of this effect. And of course that effect is whenever this minion survives damage, summon another Grim Patron. So yeah, it's a 5-mana 3/3, which sounds pretty bad, but when you can turn it into a board full of 3 2s, 3 3s, and 3 1s, suddenly you understand why Grim Patron is so powerful. You can kind of get infinite stat value out of this card if you play it well. It's difficult for opponents to remove. It's really great at building a board presence. It's just a solid overall card. It's very well designed because it doesn't look good at first glance, but in the right hands and the right deck, it becomes a nightmare to deal with, and has defined the Warrior class for a very long time. So Grim Patron to me is the 2nd best card in the set. But there's one more that is better. It is the legendary 6 mana card, the best overall Blackrock Mountain card, Emperor Thoris. This 6 mana 5/5 has one of the game's best effects, I think. A lot of people consider it overpowered when it was first revealed, and a lot of people consider it overpowered to this day. At the end of your turn, reduce the cost of cards in your hand by 1. So yeah, that means if you have 9 cards in your hand, you get a 9 mana total value efficiency reduction. That's like 4.5 innervates in a single turn, right? So yeah, Emperor Thoris sets up and creates opportunities for absurd combos from spells, like double combos from druids, multiple burn spells from mage. And sometimes it's just great at generating tempo value. Sometimes you get a Dr. Boom out a turn earlier, or get that Tyrion out a turn earlier. So there's really no deck that Emperor Thoris doesn't fit into, because it has a solid body, a crazy effect. I kind of think this card might still be played even if it was a 6 mana 3/3. So that tells you just how good it is. But when you get that extra stat and the good body attached to this crazy effect, there's just no downsides to playing Emperor Thoris. It sets up crazy plays. It makes your deck better and more powerful more quickly. It's good on its own. It forces reactions and friction from your opponent. It's really the ultimate card and one of the best 6-drops in the game, and certainly to my eye the best Blackrock Mountain card in the game as well. So there you have it. That's my list of the 10 best Blackrock cards. I'm sure you disagree on some level or think I got the order all wrong. Well, let me know in the comments. I'd appreciate to hear your discussion. So until next time, game on.